On March 11th and 12th, we were holding the spring EdTech cadre session, or the winter EdTech cadre session. And about 10:30 at night on the 11th, I got a call from Jennifer Patterson, my assistant superintendent, who said, you need to get in touch with everybody. There's no public meetings as of tomorrow. The governor has ordered no public meetings. So I sent out an email to everybody and then, excuse me, went into the ESD where we were the next morning and was promptly called back into the office where we started talking about distance learning and what was going to happen. And I said, we have a few challenges. One is broadband connectivity in our state. In my image, the background you can see is actually a satellite tower that is on Mount Fanny out in Eastern Oregon. And this is, Christina talked earlier about the stories I told about shoveling the snow off the satellite dish in Eastern Oregon. Well, it's a full day process for that to happen because they have to go from La Grande, drive a tractor with a cat on the back of it, or a truck with a trailer with a cat on the back, up to where the mountain's too steep to be able to climb anymore with the truck, the road ends. Then they take the cat up to where it's too steep to drive the cat. Then they snowshoe up and climb up this 150-foot tower that's full of ice and snow, as you can see from the image, the big tall thing behind my head, and shovel the snow off the satellite dish. And if it snows the next day again, we have some challenges. But what happened in the department following that day, we put out a survey to districts to get some information. We knew we had connectivity issues. We knew we had device issues. We knew we had families having access to internet being a challenge for them, whether they could afford it or whether it was even available in their area. And then we knew that teachers were going to have to make an overnight shift. So we collected information and put together a couple of different reports from that were shared across our office and shared with some of our leaders. The other thing that we did, and this was amazing to see the whole office pull together on this, and we have a great team working on the Oregon Open Learning site. The Oregon Open Learning Hub on OER Commons was stood up within about 2 weeks, and we keep putting more content in there. We're going to be doing more sessions about the Oregon Open Learning site this summer, so please watch for those. This is a place to look for content. It's also a place to put content. Now I'm going to pitch this over to Christina because Christina is the one that really started the Go Open movement in the country. Oregon was one of the first states to sign on. But Christina, can you talk a little bit about that for us, please?
Sure. So I distinctly remember being at Skywalker Ranch with Carla whenever I found out that I had gotten the fellowship at the U.S. Department of Education, and I had the chance to be able to lead this work for the country, which is pretty fantastic. So when I was in the classroom, like many of you, when you were in the classroom as well, you begged, borrowed, and stole, there we go, and would, reinvent the things that others had, your co-teachers, people from other buildings, things that were passed down in a filing cabinet, might have been a really random worksheet. But we also recognize the importance of copyright and intellectual property. And so when I moved to the state, I was also the school library liaison for the Department of Education. For school accreditation purposes, they require a full-time school librarian for every 250 students. And so I learned a lot from my school librarians around copyright, fair use, and open educational resources in the context of not only teaching and learning, but also ed tech. And so I started to do a lot of training across the state with teachers and even students for that matter about how to respect copyright, how to also respect fair use as well as any sort of intellectual property. And that led me into this community of a lot of higher ed folks, but then also recognizing that the U.S. Department of Education wanted to take a bigger stand on being able to provide these resources and kind of catalyze the work that was happening in smaller districts and pockets all around the country. And so that's exactly what Go Open is and was, and that it was a commitment by a school district to replace one textbook in one grade level and in one content area, not a full K-12 spread right away, but with open educational resources. And those are a little different than our traditional free resources. Free resources still imply that there's a copyright attached to them, but openly licensed resources means that there's something like an open license that's attached to them that allow their free use, reuse, modification, and sharing with others. And so the 5 R's, if you are not familiar with it, the 5 R's are the reuse, where you get to reuse the content, retain it. You get to retain the content in perpetuity, no license on an annual basis or anything like that. Revise and remix, which are critical components of OER, where you get to customize the content. So we know that textbooks are traditionally written for California, Texas, Florida, and New York, not applicable to us necessarily in Oregon or in Omaha or in Nebraska where I was. And so whenever I could take the content and customize it and localize it so that students would see their own local context in that, that was really helpful. And so whenever I have something that's openly licensed, I have the ability to do that. Remixing is simply kind of a mashup of all the things. We already do this anyway. We pull a YouTube video here, we pull an assessment here, we pull a lesson or an activity, and we mash it up and create something new with it. And that's a remix. And then the redistribution is putting it back out there for others to be able to use. So Martine and I, have already made sure that we have a CC license on our slide deck from today, and we want you to be able to take that and reuse it and redistribute with your own staff. And those are all really critical pieces, but there is full content that exists out there. And that's what we wanted folks to be able to understand, is that we are so entrenched in a tradition when it comes to selecting instructional materials, where we call the publishing companies, or we work with our ESDs to be able to call publishing companies and bring us those new instructional materials. And they are shiny and they are pretty, but oftentimes they're very expensive. And right now we know that a lot of physical materials we can't even access. And so we're looking for alternatives as far as digital materials, and publishing companies know this, and they know that we are looking for that. And so there are other options out there, and it's really important for us to know that. So OER Commons has been around for well over 10 years, and it is a crowdsourced platform. I do want to make sure that people understand that. People contribute their content, and they also identify through metadata, and that's the technical side of things, where they can identify materials that are out there that are openly licensed, and they can pull them into their repository. So there are individual learning objects, then you could build into full units, like I taught grade 2, and I could do a full geometry unit on fractions and built my own kind of unit, pre-assessment, small group, whole group activities, independent learning, an assessment to make sure that they had mastered the standard. And then there are full comprehensive kind of textbooks as well as courses that exist that are openly licensed. And so OER Commons is one of the most robust repositories that exists. And I'm really excited that Oregon has now joined and have a hub within it.
We're all pretty excited about that, especially Vanessa. So when I spoke earlier this morning, I talked about our visit with the governor, where we talked about our immediate needs. These all came out of those surveys that the districts completed in late March and early April. Internet access and connectivity was one of the big ones. We know we have a very rural state. A lot of people out there were like, well, just give those kids a hotspot. And it's like, well, you've got to have cell phone service for those to work. So there was some learning that happened along the way with that as well. What we heard from that summit was about re-engineering and reinventing student learning. We know that it's going to be an iterative process as we take steps forward, take a few steps back, and move forward again in the coming year. We know that we need momentum. One of the things that I strongly encourage you to do is bring in your partners from community, your partners from your community-based organizations, philanthropy where you can, and your business partners, because they will be by your side. And what happens then is the voice going forward to your communities, to your boards, to our legislators, isn't just education speaking, it's everybody speaking. and that gives a lot more volume to the chorus. Very excited, and this is a hot link up here, the Comprehensive Distance Learning Grant Program. Applications will be out next week. This is an allocation to every district that's based on a variety of things, including poverty, including ruralness, including the number of students that are your BIPOC community, part of your children of color. A variety of different things went into that to really address right up front the equity and the equitable issues that we are facing in the state. Districts will be able to use this funding for a variety of things. You can see the list there, and we're fine-tuning that application so that you have it in your hands next week. And we want to get those funds out to districts as quickly as we can because we know you need them. And we also know this is only the tip of the iceberg. This was a start. The governor, though, I'm very thankful that the governor saw the need based on the data that we shared with her and the recommendations from the Connect Oregon Students for Learning Summit, because she held strong and despite a lot of competing priorities, held that money for us. Necessity, the mother of invention. We are forced into what we're doing right now, and probably would not have been the way that we jumped into learning for this next year. But we're going to need to embrace that iterative process. We have an enormous design challenge ahead. As Brene Brown says, there's no innovation and creativity without failure, period. So we know that we're going to try some things that don't work, but we also know that we're going to try some things that work really well and that are new. And I think Martine shared some great ideas with us this morning related to those sorts of things. As I said this morning, when Cole asked participants yesterday about the different areas where they were spending their time, care and connection was the highest rated, and innovation was the lowest rated. But what we are doing is innovation. It's innovation created by the pandemic in many ways. But I think the thing that I try to do, instead of looking at this as more on the challenge side, I look at it more as an opportunity side. There are a lot of people who have been trying to push technology more broadly across our schools, making sure that more kids have devices from year to year, making sure that teachers have the professional learning and the skill sets for using the technology to create opportunities for students to use that technology for engaging their learning, enhancing their learning, and extending it to things that they're excited about. But not everyone heard that chorus. Now a lot more people are hearing it because of the pandemic. So let's grab this, seize this opportunity to make the changes that we want to see in our schools. Not all at once. For deep learning, it's a layering process. And as teachers pick up skills, students will pick up skills, and learning and teaching will change over time and get better. That's my hope. Christina and Martine talked about the realities and the possibilities. That was quite the exciting list of things. And yes, there's been several questions in the chat before, in the chat, and even I've gotten some texts in the meantime saying we need those slides, and they will be available to everybody. But we know that as we're testing this year, we're trying to reach those kids that during the school closures in the spring, many of them, we reached out to families, but they were hard to find. There's a lot of planning this year about doing home visits. working with community-based organizations to find and bring those families back into the learning. So we've got to think broadly. We've got to think differently. Let's tie back to the keynote a little bit. Christina, can you add to this?
Sure. What would you like to talk about?
Well, the realities and the possibilities. When you think about
Yeah.
the possibilities, what would you say you're most excited about?
I'm actually really excited to think outside the box. And I know that when you were talking about the innovation, I think it's really interesting to hear that, because I typed in the chat, the way that leaders and teachers are constantly kind of shifting gears right now and being able to adapt to kind of these new realities is innovation. Whether that, again, like if I go back to the example of my colleague in Uganda, where like they sent home the paper and the materials, as many materials as they possibly had, and then they repurposed a traditional communications app like WhatsApp to be able to carry on that teaching and learning. That's not something that we normally would have ever considered. And I know that there are certainly some privacy concerns with WhatsApp, and like we can get into a whole discussion on that. But the fact that they were able to find a low bandwidth way in order to continue their learning, and they were one of the only schools in the entire country of Uganda that actually completed their school year. So that speaks volumes. And I know that there are ways that that there are districts that are working with local tribes that are making sure that students are supported there. And how could we tap into the elders and the community members to be more community-based and not necessarily have to worry about being in a physical brick and mortar to learn. One of my favorite activities that I did when I taught second grade, I had been working with an educational consultant, Angela Myers, who came into Omaha Public Schools, and she had this idea about learning now and talking to students about what they had learned in the past 24 hours. And it did not have to be school related. And so that was our first venture into getting my students on social media. So we had a class Twitter account, and at the end of each day, we would sit down in circle in small group, and we would tweet out what we had learned in the past 24 hours. And we called it our Learning Now experience. And that at that point, you know, second grade, they are going through confirmation classes. I worked in a high Latinx population. And so a lot of them were in multifamily kind of scenarios or multi-generational families. And so they were learning kind of traditions and culture with their family members. And so I had students that would say, I learned how to make enchiladas with my mom last night. And so we would tweet these things out. And I think that it's important for us to remember that learning is not exclusive to a brick and mortar school. And so we can really reach out and work with our communities to provide these different learning opportunities that are not necessarily what we call school. And that's okay. That's okay, because everyone is in this position right now.
I think the other thing I'd recommend is get into conversations, whether you're following somebody on Twitter or even in folks on Facebook. I was on the Facebook just tootling around about 2 weeks ago, and up flashed this virtual reality tour of this phenomenal basilica in Madrid. And it was Hal Davidson, who was playing with Oculus Rift. And there's, you know, a lot of conversation going on about when we think about the future and the possibilities of being able to have the teacher drive the Oculus Rift, but using Zoom or even Facebook, they were testing both, to be able to take kids on a tour of this beautiful basilica in Madrid. And then at another place, they went to Philadelphia and compared the town hall in Philadelphia with the I forget what it was called, the parliamentary building in France, that was almost a mirror design or an identical image of the two buildings. It was clear, though, that one was built in the 1740s and one was built in the early 1900s. But to be able to discover those things and talk about architecture and talk about cities, take kids on virtual tours to places that many of us will never get to go. We
Sure.
do live in a global society, and that's one of the powers of the technology now, is to allow us to do global collaboration. I've been participating with some of my colleagues from ODE in the Global Online Learning Gathering, and I was in a meeting with some folks from Brazil and Canada and Uganda. I think it was Uganda, someplace in Africa. And we were talking and comparing notes and comparing poverty in different countries and strategies. It's that idea of sharing strategies that's going to be helpful. I know one of the lessons I learned was that in Estonia, it's a pretty small country, they took all of their lead teachers, the teachers who were really advanced in the way that they use technology, and they brought them in to be the trainers, the professional learning providers for all of the other teachers in the state as they made the shift from face-to-face to online learning. So there's all kinds of possibilities out there in the realities that we are living in today.
Absolutely.
Oops. So collaboration is key, and technology helps us with that collaboration. As I said, find your champions. Let those champions, whether they're your families, your students, your community, your business, let them know you need them and that they need to be at the table as you help build solutions. We talked about, I've talked several times, we've heard the terms reinvent, redesign, transform, but I think what we're really doing right now is re-engineering. We're skillfully and artfully rearranging, because in an event or a situation to occur, we are rearranging what we do in schools. We are creating new ways of doing things. It's a design process. It's an iterative process. So therefore, we're re-engineering. I like one of the best resources I have found lately that just came out this summer. Actually, when I first started reading it, it was only available in an ebook form. It's the Distance Learning Playbook by Fisher, Gray, and Hattie. It actually works kind of like a professional development as you're going through the book. It gives you activities to stop and reflect as you're learning, and it also has QR codes that take you to videos that illustrate the concept that they're talking about. I highly recommend it. And I love this quote from the book. Our mission is to cultivate and engage learners really stands out for me. So what are you doing to cultivate and engage learners? What are you doing that others should know? What are those ideas that you can share with the group? And have you found any great resources, books, or research that has guided your planning? I'm going to ask everyone before we're going to split up into breakout groups. So there are some wonderful ideas here. I think there are still a lot of questions out there about how we do some of these things, but then we've been able to capture some of these, which to me, as we're writing guidance, this is extremely helpful to see what your greatest needs are, your greatest challenges are, so that it gives us an area to start focusing on what needs to happen. Our anonymous sheep is still working diligently. Group A. Were there any ahas that any of you had that you'd like to share? Any things that really stood out? And I think you can unmute yourself to speak up.
I'm unmuting. Sorry, I have a lot of competing noise with some construction at a neighboring house. So I was trying to put it in the chat. And Jacob was in my group there, and he put something in the chat too. The thing that struck me, frankly, in our group is just how critical it is to have opportunities to talk to each other to say, what are you doing about this? And do you have any ideas about that? And where did you find a resource on that thing? And have you heard anything? So I think as ODE and, you know, as we're writing guidance and getting feedback about guidance and getting over the hump of the school year starting, I think looking for ways to bring people together to be able to share resources and ideas and get support and creatively think together is one of the resources, if you will, that people really are interested in. But would love more feedback on that.
I think you hit the nail on the head, is being able to talk to people, just even understanding what they're doing, you know, whether it is similar roles or similar size districts is really helpful. In our breakout, you know, I asked the question as far as Erin works for an ESD and is trying to figure out how to support all of the schools that are within that ESD. And something I go back to for distance learning in particular is this whole idea of templates. And when you are introducing a learning management system or a new tool in particular, cognitive load can be really high. And so it's important to try to lower that cognitive load. We hear this like just anecdotally from students from this past spring, but we also hear this from folks all the time, especially like dual enrollment or dual credit kind of courses where students are in a physical high school setting, but then they're attending college level classes, and they have 5 different platforms that they have to use and have to navigate that and be able to access it, navigate it, and then use it. And the same thing when we think about some sort of learning management system when it comes to what we're going to be doing this and how we're going to be starting the school year. If you can template or templatize things so that people know when I enter this classroom, even if it's for ELA compared to science, compared to social studies, I know where to navigate to find the calendar. I know where to navigate to find the assignments. I know, and then you provide the choice within all of those things and allow teachers to be able to teach the way that they want to, but being able to provide that same structure will lower that cognitive load and then allow students to be able to access, navigate, and use that tool much easier. And that also works for parents, because we know that the parents are going to be our biggest partner, or caregivers, I should say. Parents and caregivers are incredibly important as far as partners in all of this. And so we want to make sure that they also understand where to go to access, navigate, and use all of these things. Use the word blueprint. I like that. Yes. Template is overused. Blueprint. I like this. Blueprint. Thanks, Drew. I'm going to use that.
Okay, I'm going to take us all back to Mentimeter, and you should be able to see that on my screen now. Green screen with white print. What are you most optimistic about for the 2020-2021 school year?
I love these answers. Maybe it's like the optimism in me, or the just, I don't know, like that we are scrappy as a field, and we manage to turn things into positive situations despite challenges. But thank you for providing some of these thoughts. It's really great to read. And I mean scrappy in the best possible way, just so you know.
What's exciting for me here is I see a lot of hope as I'm reading through these. And I think as Cynthia said, it's what I have found most helpful during this time is to be able to talk to my colleagues about the challenges, to learn what other states or what other countries are doing, and to learn from you about what you're doing, because you are the ones that are really leading the charge. You're leading the innovation. You're re-engineering education for our students. I'm going to let this scroll a little bit, and because my next slide is basically just questions. You can either use the chat or unmute your mics and ask questions to either Christina or I as we start winding down this session. And you probably hear sirens in the background at my house. Sorry, it's not the dog, at least this time.
There you go. I just dropped my email address and my Twitter handle in the chat. So if you want to follow up with me, if you have any questions, or if you're looking for connections to some folks that I mentioned, or if you even have like a potential scenario that you want to connect with others. It's one of my favorite things to do. I collect people and I like to connect them. So I love making introductions. So please let me know if I can help with that.
She's a connector. She's very good at that. Okay, with that, we'll give you a little bit of time back for a little bit longer, well, couple 3-minute break before the 3 minutes added to your break before the next session. Thank you all very much. We really enjoyed having you here today for this conversation. I will make both the results of the Mentimeter, these comments, and you all have the link to the Google Doc so that you can refer back to that for ideas or thoughts as we move forward. I look forward to having more of these conversations with you all this year. I want to learn from you, and I'm going to seek out as many people like Martine and Christina as I can to bring messages of what other people are doing in other places, but messages of hope and care and connection as we move forward. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.